Tanner Humanities Center Author Meets Reader series is just what it sounds like. We bring authors from across the world and across campus to discuss their recent work with you, readers, who get an in-depth look at cutting-edge research. When we do Author Meets Reader series with our U of U College of Humanities faculty, we get to give our faculty and students an introduction to our colleagues' work and a celebration of their recent publications. I was just saying to Danielle, it's kind of too often in academia, we put our research out there. It goes out into the world, it goes into a journal, it goes into books, and we really hope it gets read. With luck, it gets read. These Author Meets Reader series are an opportunity for us to introduce that work and see that people are become aware of the kind of work we're doing here at the university. So this is an introduction to and a celebration of that work. Today we welcome Danielle Endres and Logan Gomez to discuss Danielle's book, Nuclear Decolonization, Indigenous Resistance to High-Level Nuclear Waste Siting. Logan Gomez is an assistant professor of communication at the University of Utah in the areas of rhetoric and critical cultural studies. Their research interests lie at the intersections of rhetoric, race, and violence. Informed by Black feminist theories, perspectives, and activism, Logan's current research trajectory compels them to ask questions about racialized temporalities and the rhetorics of erasure, preservation, and possibility. Their work has been published in Rhetoric Society Quarterly, Communication and Critical Cultural Studies, and First Amendment Studies, with forthcoming collaborative work in Rhetoric, Politics, and Culture, and Women's Studies and Communication. Danielle Endres is professor of communication and director of the Environmental Humanities program here at the University of Utah. Her research areas are environmental communication, indigenous communication, and rhetorical studies. Her research projects focus on the rhetoric of environmental and science controversies, including nuclear waste siting decisions, climate change, and energy transitions. Her work is guided by principles of environmental justice and focuses on how underrepresented and marginalized groups, particularly Native peoples and nations, engage in environmental advocacy. In addition to nuclear decolonization, Danielle is the co-author of Participatory Critical Rhetoric, Theoretical and Methodological Foundations of Studying Rhetoric in Situ, and co-editor of several books, including the Rutledge Handbook of Energy Democracy. The National Science Foundation and several fellowships from the University of Utah have funded her research. Endres is currently working on two projects: analysis of energy justice campaigns in Puerto Rico, and a collaborative project with the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation to collect historical archives for the nation. Endres' public advocacy work includes being a member of the state of Utah's Hazardous Waste and Radiation Control Board and serving as treasurer of the Utah campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. Outside of work, she enjoys walking in mountains, seeing live music, reading mysteries, and spending time with her partner, kids, and cats. Please join me in welcoming Danielle and Logan.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to begin with a very brief summary that is in Dr. Danielle Endres' own words. I highly recommend you check out the Humanities Radio interview with Jana Cunningham and Dr. Danielle Endres. This is where I've pulled this summary from, and there's also a lot of other really beautiful moments where Danielle talks about the book. So please go check that out. The book looks at nuclear decolonization, which is a theory and a set of practices that were created by Indigenous people. In this case, Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Goshute peoples, to resist the nuclear production process. In particular, to resist nuclear waste sites that were proposed for their lands. And in the book, Dr. Danielle Endres identifies two key strategies or tactics that were used by these activists to defend their lands. The first is Indigenous land rhetorics, which focuses on how Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Goshute peoples articulate the value of their land and the way that nuclear waste would impact that. And the second is national interest rhetorics, which looks at the ways that these nations are nations and evaluate what's in their interest versus the interest of the United States federal government. So to begin, I am curious how you became interested in exploring the intersections of nuclearism and settler colonialism.
Yes, and this story goes back a really long time, actually. I'm a child of the 70s, so I grew up when nuclear weapons were really scary and something that was really on my mind a lot. I also grew up in a place where one of the major actions by the American Indian movement happened, and that was Alcatraz Island. So very early on, I was interested in environmentalisms, anti-nuclear movements, and also Indigenous resistance movements. And so then when I got to college, so this really does go far back, I got interested in uranium mining on native lands in the Southwest and Intermountain West regions. And that began this many multi-year kind of research into nuclear colonization, which is a system that combines settler colonialism and nuclearism in ways that proportionately harms Native peoples and nations. And then that led me to do a series of projects over my time, and then most recently to this book, which shifts the focus to nuclear decolonization, which is a way of thinking through the ways that Native peoples, nations, and communities were enacting rhetorical forms of decolonization, those two strategies that you mentioned in the beginning.
Thank you. If you haven't read the book yet, there are a lot of very gorgeous arguments that are kind of scaffolded across the book. So my question for Danielle is, what currently do you understand to be the overarching argument of the book, and why? Like, what brought you there? Why was that significant for you?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think one of the things I want to start with is that the main argument of the book is not mine, and that's maybe a strange thing for an academic to say, but the main argument that I promote in the book is the theories that were being developed on site by Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Goshute folks in their advocacy against nuclear waste sites. And it was really important for me in the book to decenter myself as the academic that came with the theory that could explain what was happening, and to rather see that theory was being developed by the folks that I was engaging with over time. And so the main theoretical argument is me retelling and amplifying the theories of the folks that I worked with. In terms of the argument that I think is really important for my field, environmental humanities, communication, and beyond, is a mode of doing research. And so how do I, as a non-Indigenous white settler woman, engage in research with communities that are not my own communities that I seek to ally with? And so what I think is really an important book that important argument that I'm trying to send with this book is the argument of how might we, as academics, build theory alongside, amplify theories that are happening, and then model ways of doing research that are in support of the goals and needs of the community. And so I make a lot of methodological arguments as well that I think are really important. I'm hoping that our fields will shift in the way that we think about doing research, particularly research with social movements and also with Indigenous peoples and nations. And then I make some interventions, some arguments. I'm giving you guys a lot of arguments right now. There's a lot in the book, but how especially non-Indigenous researchers might go about engaging in this type of research.
Yeah, since you brought up the role of your identity, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Towards the end of the book, you talk about the intellectual as the distiller of knowledge, and you mark this very clear shift between the academic becoming a storyteller, an archivist, a collaborator. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you've seen that shift in your own kind of research journey and the making of this book.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I've said to a lot of people, I would have written a very different book if I had written this 10, 15 years ago. I think early in my career, when I was particularly more focused on the nuclear colonization piece of this research, I was really trying to embody that role of the academic that sort of comes in and has the theories that then allow us to make sense of what we're seeing, the rhetorical practices that we're seeing. And one thing that really shifted for me, a couple of things. I mean, one thing that shifted is that I became I've been in this field for a really long time. I got to a place where I wasn't as worried as I had been about sort of finding that new, unique theoretical contribution. I do think I make contributions in the book, but I wasn't as concerned about kind of identifying and distilling a clear theoretical point. And then another thing that shifted was that I was seeing that this movement had succeeded. And yet, if there were not communities of people that were coming together to archive and tell this story, that was a real loss. And so one of the things that really inspired me is this idea that remembering and paying attention to moments of success in movements is really important. And when you're working with communities that are not always allowed to share their stories, or it's not in the interest of dominant forces to archive and share those stories, that the act as a collaborative researcher to create an archive and then tell those stories is, to me, a really important part of being an academic. And so that's how I make that kind of argument, that we're not as much the distillers of knowledge, we are archivists, we are collaborating alongside those, and this goes in hand with the argument I made earlier, that the theory is really coming from the practitioners in this case.
Yeah, one of my reads of the book is that rhetoric is a significant lens or orientation that you use. And I was wondering if you could speak to the importance of thinking nuclear decolonization rhetorically. What does that give you uniquely rather than writing about it from another lens?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm a rhetorician, so it's sort of how I'm going to approach anything that I do. And obviously, I think rhetoric and rhetorical studies are important, or I wouldn't have spent many years of my life getting a degree in that. But I think what it does is it really hones in on the justification systems, the arguments, the symbol systems that have to accompany any sort of change or any sort of colonization or decolonization. So to put it really simply, we can't make change in this world if we're not using language and other symbol systems to persuade, to influence, to disrupt, and to intervene. And so much of the research that is out there on nuclear colonization has really focused very importantly on verifying that this has happened. There have been more uranium mines located near indigenous populations. There have been more nuclear waste sites that have been proposed for nuclear populations. But rhetoric allows us to delve into how is that happening, and how is that happening through the ways that people are talking about it, or the ways that people are enacting these embodied and emplaced arguments about it. So to me, rhetoric then is this window or this lens that we can really see how language and other symbol systems are crucial. They're not separate from material changes. They're already imbued with material changes.
Yeah, I love that perspective. And if you haven't read the book yet, you can kind of see Danielle's dedication to documenting what's actually happening on the ground through a rhetorical lens. I also am a rhetoric nerd, so those parts of the book for me are very intellectually rich. I just heard you use the language embodied and emplaced, and I'm wondering if you can maybe speak more to the importance of those terms for you.
Yeah, definitely. So often when we think of rhetoric, or maybe not as often anymore, but traditionally when folks thought about rhetoric, they thought about spoken word or written word. And so this was a faculty of language that could be used to persuade or influence or disrupt. And something that I've done throughout my career is try to think, and others, I'm not the only one that does this, of course, but to think about the ways that rhetoric also functions through bodies collecting together, engaging in a protest event, or the way we might design a space is rhetorical. It's sending messages or sending influence. So I use those terms not only to be able to talk about embodied and place-based rhetoric in the book, but I also think that if we think of rhetoric outside of that lens, I mean, rhetoric is always done by a being. I won't necessarily say that has to be a human being, but it's always done by a being in a place. And much of kind of traditional rhetorical work, in my mind, was really separating the words out from the embodied and emplaced experience that happens. And I think for this book, it's particularly important because the Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Goshute folks that I was working with were, were making these arguments at the Nevada test site, at the site of the Skull Valley nuclear waste site, within and being in relation with these lands that they loved and wanted to protect. And so it felt that it would sort of sever out some of the importance of the rhetorical tactics to not think of them as both embodied and emplaced.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things I really valued about the book is the kind of descriptive language you use to write about the lands. And so I just wanted to share a quick piece before I ask the question for folks who haven't read it. So there's very beautiful language throughout the book, but one of the moments that I pulled, Danielle writes, Skull Valley is a 4th-mile valley between Stansbury and Cedar Mountain ranges, typically of the basin and range topography. It is a beautiful desert valley with natural springs, sagebrush that transitions into alpine landscape in the mountains, and a diversity of plant and animal species. And there are some other chapters where Danielle is describing kind of for the reader to see what these lands look like and what they have to offer. And so the question that brought up for me is, why did it feel important for you to write descriptively about the lands in addition to like the resistance tactics?
Yeah, the lands were just so important to the Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Goshute people that I was working with and nations. And, I devote a whole chapter to lands rhetorics, which are rhetorics that are about the relationships with places and with these particular lands and all the beings that live in them. And so it was really important for me to describe that for folks that had never had the opportunity to be there. One of the things that has been so important for me in writing this book and research I've done prior to it is having so many opportunities to go to these places. Skull Valley is just down the road, so that was easy for me once I took this job here. But I had also traveled many times to Nua land, Western Shoshone land, and Southern Paiute land to be in community with activists and land protectors, but also to get a sense of that land. And one of the things that happened when I first went out to these lands, I grew up in California and then lived in Seattle, kind of all West Coast. And so when I initially encountered these places, I probably had those very same misconceptions that many of the first European settlers had about these places. I looked at it and I thought, where are the trees? This is dusty, this is brown, this feels like a desert, this feels not as lifelike as a redwood tree that I would have experienced growing up. And I needed to get to that place where I found beauty and found spiritual connection and found relationship with these lands to really do justice, I think, to the arguments that those I was working with were making. And so for the reader, I wanted to be able to describe those places the way that I see them and then use, some of my participants' language the way that they see it. I think it's very common for folks that don't live in this region to see those areas as wastelands. In fact, I talk about this a little in the book. I mean, why do we want to cite nuclear waste in these places? Because they're perceived as lifeless wasteland sort of places. And so I was hoping to kind of nudge my readers into the same, if they came to it from a feeling that I had come to it with about deserts, that I might nudge them to think differently, have a different perspective on these places.
Yeah, you have to do a lot of work to kind of balance writing about different lands and different peoples. And so I'm interested in a writing question, which is like, what was that process like for you to balance the writing of moving across different land? And how did you do that as a cultural outsider?
Yeah. There's a reason this book took me about 20 years to write. I really wanted to do it with care and respect as much as I could. But I also knew I needed to write a book because I think I couldn't do this comparative work that I wanted to do in a journal article length piece. So previous research had not put these two cases of the Skull Valley Ghost Shoots and the Western Shoshone and Southern Paiute together because it was too hard to do that. So a couple of things that I employed. I really dived into historical cultural knowledge as much as I could, and just tried to sit with those and sit with them as long as I could, and encourage myself to really not only see similarities that were maybe coming through these cases, but also to respect the different perspectives that were coming out of these different nations and communities that I was working with. As an outsider, I felt like I had to do really good due diligence to make sure that I was not imposing my own views on this history or imposing my own views on these places. So that just took a lot of time. I think as an outsider, I engaged in a lot of self-reflexivity moments to think through, why I was doing the project, think through conversations that I was having, even small things like remembering that when I talked to one member of the Western Shoshone, that wasn't the entire Western Shoshone nation speaking to me, and thinking through these differences. And I guess one other thing that I would say is that that was a real strategy throughout the book to, even though I use words like Indigenous and Native resistance, they're words of solidarity, but I really wanted to be able to specify this is what is happening with the Skull Valley Nation. And there was a divide between the nation over whether or not they wanted nuclear waste. And so I wanted to be really, really specific about that. So hopefully that answered your question.
Oh, it does, totally. Like balancing the complexity of different viewpoints on top of being a cultural outsider. When I was reading the book, I was thinking, wow, like how is Danielle balancing all of this? But you were, and you did it really well. So that answered my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm thinking about, you have kind of two major kinds of rhetorics that you're moving through. One was the land rhetorics, and then the other was the national interest rhetorics. And as I was reading, I knew that you had probably a lot of other ideas of different kinds of rhetoric that we could think through. And I'm wondering if there's any that you had to leave out or things that you were like, oh, I just can't fit it in this book that maybe you'd be willing to share with us.
Yes. Yeah, there's one in particular, and I really wanted to make space for Indigenous ecological knowledges and Indigenous science knowledges, so Western Shoshone science, Southern Paiute science, and Skull Valley Ghost Shoot science and ecological knowledges. It does come out a little bit when I talk about lands, and so I think it's an under kind of current of the book. But yeah, I had actually originally planned a whole chapter that would lay out the ways that in addition to these other two strategies and other ones as well, that kind of enacting the ways that their knowledge is just as important as the sort of Western scientific knowledge was really important as well in stopping these two nuclear waste sites. So yeah, I wish I could have put it in, but it didn't work in this iteration, but I hope to return to that idea maybe in the future.
I was going to say future material for us all. Looking forward to that. Yeah. Absolutely. What for the readers, like what are the key lessons that you hope for readers to encounter or walk away with in terms of nuclear decolonization? Yeah, I want people to talk more about nuclear decolonization than nuclear colonization. That's a key point that I make. And that was a shift that I had to make in my own thinking as well. And I think it's really important because it shifts focus away from seeing colonization or even seeing Native folks as sort of, I wouldn't see them this way, but as like passive recipients of colonial forces, right? And so when we're so focused on highlighting those rhetorical strategies of colonization,
we risk kind of potentially doing that and potentially, removing some agency from folks who had tons of agency and who have been fighting colonization since 1492. So thinking through the ways that we can look at the rhetorics of decolonization is, I think, really important and something I hope people get out of the book. I also want people to get out of the book the argument that activism matters. It works. And, this circles back to something I was saying earlier, but I think that, don't get me wrong, we have to be constantly vigilant, and nuclear colonization is still happening. This isn't, it's not been solved, but we have to stop and reflect on those moments when successful campaigns were mounted. These 2 nuclear waste sites that I thought for sure would get cited didn't happen. And that is in large part because of the tactics that were used by these land protectors. And so I want to remember that it works, and that identifying those rhetorical tactics that work can not only be an archive, a memory bank, but can also be tools for future activists to potentially use. People don't know maybe as much about nuclear waste siting or nuclear colonization, but we certainly hear a lot about pipeline resistance coming out of Native communities, other forms of decolonization. And I think that, hopefully there are some resonances that folks can find between what these activists did and what other activists are doing.
Yeah, I am thinking a lot about success and successful movements. For those who are not in rhetoric and probably specifically communication, folks tend to write a lot about quote unquote failed movements. And so I felt like this was kind of a breath of fresh air that reinvigorated the power of successful movements. I'm wondering if from the time your book, you had to send it off, it was done, was there any other news or any other happenings that maybe transpired from the end of your book till now that you've been kind of watching that you'd like to share?
Yeah. I'm pretty sure Yucca Mountain is not going to happen, but every once in a while, legislators or, it comes back up into conversation. Ian Zaparte, one of the people that I interviewed for this book, is staying vigilant and continuing. He works right outside of New Orleans, where Yucca Mountain is, and is continually making sure that when ideas come up again to use Yucca Mountain, that he's right there and talking about it. So that is something I'm closely watching. The new development is that the federal government, who's responsible for storing nuclear waste, is trying to do consent-based siting. I talk a little bit about this in the conclusion. This is a great win. It used to be that when we wanted to site a toxic facility or a nuclear waste site, the model was what's called decide, announce, defend. And so it was kind of decided we're going to put it there. We announce it, we go to the community, we hold a public hearing, but really we're defending the choice. I wouldn't do that, but the federal government is doing that. And so this move to consent-based siting for nuclear waste is hugely important because it shifts the philosophy to say that communities need to be involved in decision-making from the very start and need to consent from the very beginning and then have a chance to pull out of that. So that's something I'm watching really closely. But unfortunately, since we don't have a national storage facility for nuclear waste, I'll be watching this for the rest of my life, likely, because we need a place to store nuclear waste. And so consistent with the pattern of nuclear colonization, we're seeing communities on or near native lands that are being invited to be part of the process of thinking about whether they would host a nuclear waste site. And to be clear, if a community wants it and they want it outside of any constraints, it's not their only economic opportunity, that's fine, that's sovereignty. But I think that, I need to keep watching until we've developed a place where we can store this waste.
while I was reading the book, I was maybe a little too optimistic that I was just like, why do we have to have nuclear waste at all? And I kind of felt that undertone from you as you were writing, but you were like, well, we have to write about it anyway and the beautiful activism that exists. But I kind of left with this feeling of, I just wish this was not something that anyone was having to negotiate. And I felt like you were kind of in conversation with me as I was reading your book there.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I think that one of the things, and I'm a critical scholar, so making political statements is not averse to a scholar like me. But I don't think that detracts from the rigorous academic work that I've done. But I think it supports it. And so I would say, and I say this in the book, it would be really irresponsible for us to continue to develop nuclear weapons and nuclear power without a solution for the waste, and without a solution that's just. There's a point in the book where I kind of ask the question of, should the U.S. government be asking native governments to store this terrible byproduct of these technologies that are largely not benefiting these communities? And so that's a really important question. But I think we could ask that kind of all of us. I mean, do we need these technologies? And certainly, let's not move forward with these technologies until we've really have a just and equitable solution to the waste.
Yeah, I agree. My last question for you before I close is, I'm often thinking about the writing process around books, and I want to know if there was a chapter that was your favorite to write, and if favorite isn't the frame, like what chapter maybe came to you with ease or that you were excited to return to in the writing process?
None of them came to me with ease.
It's fair.
And some of them were quite hard, actually. Conclusion was particularly hard. But I think the chapter I'm most proud of and I really love is the Indigenous lands rhetoric chapter. I just felt that it was so important to amplify and highlight the ways that Skull Valley Goshu, Western Shoshone and Southern Paiute folks had relationships with these lands, cared about them so much that they would risk so many things to protect these lands. And so it felt really awesome to be able to write through that. And it felt hopeful to write through that. So yeah, that's my favorite chapter.
Yeah. I'm going to close with a very short excerpt from Danielle's book that I think elevates the hopefulness. So if you'll just bear with me for a second. Okay. So this is in the conclusion. Don't skip to the conclusion if you haven't read it, but it's where all the good stuff is, Okay, so Danielle writes, nuclear decolonization then is one part of a larger story of Indigenous decolonization, survivance, and resurgence on this continent that began in 1492, lives in the present, and will animate the future until Indigenous peoples and nations are free again. Indigenous theories and practices of social change are a core and enduring presence in this place. What settlers named the U.S. that have persistently prevented settler colonialism's goal to eliminate the native from becoming complete. The ongoing presence of Indigenous movements for social change and decolonization is something to commemorate. For non-Indigenous people seeking to be allies or comrades in Indigenous decolonization, these movements are something to stand alongside, amplify, and disseminate. This is why this book retells stories of nuclear decolonization. Telling these stories is important, not only because of my accountability to the peoples and places who asked me and others to share them, but also because they illuminate a vital star in the beautiful constellation of Indigenous social change. Thank you so much, Danielle.
Thank you, Logan. Okay, we have a good amount of time for audience Q&A, and after all, this is an author meets readers event. So it's the reader's turn if you have some questions for Danielle. Appreciate it.
I have to admit, I haven't read the book yet, Danielle. I promise I will.
Okay.
But I really appreciate what you're doing, as I always do. I always appreciate opportunities to hear about what you're doing, particularly since we have a lot of rhetoricians at the university and they're split two different departments, so we're close, but could be a little bit closer. My question actually is about what I imagine is, just from my own lay perspective, the sort of like the changing rhetorical ecologies, to use Jenny Bauer's phrase, or like rhetorical complexities around nuclear power. That, there have certainly been times, and I can remember very directly 3 Mile Island, I can remember Chernobyl, of course I can remember Fukushima, but I remember times then when there was a big national conversation, even on the East Coast where I grew up, because there was no nuclear waste siting where I grew up, of course. But about like, well, nuclear power, we thought it was a great idea, but now it's done, we need to move on. It seems like more recently, for reasons having to do with maybe, some of the other work that you do with respect to environmentalism, that nuclear power is kind of making a comeback, or at least trying to. Whether it is, cleaner versions of fission, or whether it's nuclear fusion, we got to put all the money into that. I'm just wondering about the complexities of that, and how that informs how your project here might circulate, and how it might inform some of the complexities around not only scholarship, but also activism.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. We are seeing a resurgence, and it's often called the nuclear renaissance among the kind of environmentalist communities. And it's essentially centering on, with climate change, with the need to transition to other energy sources very quickly. The argument is that nuclear is a clean energy source, and so it makes sense to kind of amp that up, to also work towards fusion, to work towards small modular reactors. This is a new technology that's coming out. And I think that the thing that I always, when I teach about this, I always try to point out is that there's no technology that doesn't have a cradle and a grave. And so, yes, and there have been studies that have, from scientists and folks like that, who show that the production of nuclear power does have fewer carbon emissions than coal, natural gas, the higher emitters, oil. Solar, wind are lower than nuclear. But then when you tie in the cradle and the grave of those technologies, which was uranium mining on the front end, which has been incredibly damaging to this region, not just Native folks in this region, downwinders in Salt Lake City who were impacted by nuclear testing that came from uranium as well, and then this grave of nuclear waste. So it's that reminder that part of these rhetorics have to see life cycles of technologies. I also think that it's really important, and it's really interesting because it used to be that it was that sort of nuclear engineers and scientists were not environmentalists, but this new generation, and I did an ethnography with nuclear scientists and engineers, and there's this generational gap where there's young folks who got into nuclear engineering because they care about the climate and they care about climate change. And so that's what led me in the book to talk through that point, which I talked about earlier, that there's no technology that's perfect. All technologies have harms and benefits, all energy technologies. But if we don't have a solution for the waste, so just keeping waste on the minds when we talk about nuclear energy, I think is really, really, really important and has to be part of that ecology. And I think too often it's erased or ignored. In part, it's erased and ignored because it's marginalized Native populations that are the places where we want to hide this waste away.
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
Would you tell us a little bit about some of the strategies that you saw and learned about and found successful and wanted to amplify?
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of the sort of embodied and in place, I think that one of the things I talk a lot about in the book, and sometimes folks in environmental circles will talk about prefigurative politics. And if you haven't heard that term, it's sort of enacting enacting the change you want to see in the world, or enacting kind of the ideology or the way of being that you want to promote. And so I saw a lot of that happening. There was a moment that I talk about in one of the chapters, and I think this is the best example of that, where folks who went to the Nevada test site were issued Western Shoshone passports. And those were just the non-Western Shoshone people. Western Shoshone folks didn't need passports to enter their own lands. And so, we were issued these passports, and then we were encouraged to trespass on federal land, as the federal government would have called it. But in that moment, everybody who crossed into that land was enacting decolonization, or was allying with an act of decolonization. And so those kind of embodied and emplaced moments that not only enacted that, but then became media events that disseminated out and gave folks the opportunity to think through, wait a second, maybe that's not federal land. That's so interesting that someone was issued a Western Shoshone passport. So they really work in that dual way of not only kind of enacting the change, enacting a temporary moment of decolonization, but also then disseminating out and allowing people to think differently about this case. So.
I want to shift gears, if that's okay, since we're in the Tanner Humanities Center. And I want to sort of ask you to reflect on our work, sort of as humanists in a university that speaks about new knowledge and productivity. And we adopt that because we have to. But what you're talking about, what you're doing in your scholarship, is not new knowledge at all. And I just want to sort of hear why what we're doing isn't necessarily part of a neoliberal university and why it shouldn't be. And I want to ask you to sort of talk to me again, as you have in the past, about the speed of work. I'm very interested that this book took so long. I think that's appropriate. I think that should be celebrated and rewarded because the pace of our work shouldn't be fast, because it should be about a different speed of being, maybe.
Yeah. And I think, and I will tell you, for many years I was, disappointed in myself or worried that it was taking me so long to get this piece out. But now that I'm on the other side, I wouldn't have done it any other way. And I think that for me, what sustained that was the care that I have for this case and this work. So I do think that slowness and slowing down, I was just talking to students about this yesterday, that being in higher ed, being in academia, is part of the privilege, is that we do get to slow down. We get to focus intensely on one case, and more that's an act of resistance in a world that's constantly bombarding us with so many messages and so many blips and short things. So we've talked about this before, and I absolutely agree that slow, thoughtful, careful work is really important. And the question of the humanities and sort of new and I don't want to say we're not doing research and we're not doing great work with knowledge, but I think that at times the neoliberal model of higher ed is encouraging us to make these just tiny little adjustments in kind of smaller packages, and I think it's more valuable in my own kind of approach to this, and I'm privileged to be able to take this approach to really, think through that bigger picture, and even to be able to make that move to sort of decenter myself as the theorist that was coming into a community and sort of using my intellect to unpack this and make sense of something that everybody who was doing this work understood. And so, to me, I think part of the goal of this was really to take the opportunities that we have at an institution of higher learning to share these stories, amplify them, disseminate them to students, and get this material to a different audience. So hopefully that answered your question.
I'm really interested and struck by your kind of part in the beginning where you're talking a lot about reflexivity and the way that you almost have a discussion with yourself in the footnotes. I'm curious what that writing process looked like, or how did you navigate that? Because I'm assuming it took a long time and a lot of years to come to that.
Yeah. I have always been a proponent of keeping a journal, like a kind of a research journal, as you're working on a project. And so a lot of what came into the footnotes and a lot of what comes into the foreword, that's another place where I do a lot of the sort of reflexivity. I had written those things before. And as I was putting together the book, we're in a moment where I think there's a lot of folks that want to do research to amplify Native perspectives, to work with Native nations and communities. And even though it was really scary for me to do, I felt like I kind of had to put those things that I had been writing in my journals over the years into the product of the book. So that it really made some arguments about process and really highlighted moments when I really wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing writing the book, if I, just those moments of reflection. But it wasn't how I originally conceived the book, and actually, the book was going to be a different book, and I had a sabbatical, and I read lots of things, and I had a rest. I had time to slow down, and I realized that I wanted to tell the story of nuclear decolonization. I realized I wanted to kind of put my story into it a little bit more without centering myself, and so I went to the publisher and said, "Can I shift the focus of the book?" And I was really lucky that they said that I could do that. And and so I just draft after draft. I mean, again, that's why it took a really long time, because I tried lots of different ways. I had an amazing writing group, Samantha Senda-Cook, Stacey Sowards, Bridie McGreevy, who gave me lots of feedback on this. And I've had many other colleagues that read chapters. And so it was just trial and error, really, to find the tone. And I hope I found a tone that works in the self-reflexivity bit.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting. One thing that I want to ask, you mentioned these participatory processes for nuclear waste siting. Is that, just out of curiosity, does that generate enough capacity to store our waste or not? And does it?
Yeah.
if it is so, then the problem is solved, right? Or you could say the problem is solved. But if it is not so, I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't remember the number of how much waste we currently have. It's in the book. That would have exceeded what was specified for Yucca Mountain, but Yucca Mountain's really big, and so they could have, and it was specified by a law that could have been amended. So that space could have held it all. Nuclear waste spent fuel rods is currently being stored on site at all of our reactors. They're in storage pools, or they're getting moved to dry cask storage. So it is being stored now throughout the country and stored safely for the most part. If we ramp up more production of nuclear power, we haven't had a new nuclear power plant come online, I think since the 80s. I would have to double check, except there's a brand new one in Georgia that is just starting up, and that's the first one in years and years and years. So if we radically ramp up, then we need to find more space. But some of the advocates argue that it's best to just keep it where it is and not move it to a centralized storage facility like Yucca Mountain, or an interim facility like Squaw Valley. So so maybe we don't have a problem. Maybe we're safely storing it now and it's being monitored by folks, and we don't have to move it to another another place. We certainly have a bigger problem if we continue to ramp up the use of nuclear power or nuclear weapons. Thanks.
Apologies that I haven't read the book, and I look forward to if you talk about this in detail, but you mentioned that there were people in the indigenous communities on both sides. Some said, yes, we want it, some said no, which does not surprise me. And I'm really interested in how that played out and how, in the end, to all appearances, there was a unified position.
Yeah, and so I look at two cases. I look at the Yucca Mountain high-level storage facility, and then I look at the Skull Valley Go-Shoot one that was put forward by the tribal government and PFS, which is a consortium of energy companies. Pretty much with Yucca Mountain, most of the Western Shoshone Southern Paiute governments were opposed to it. It was the Skull Valley case where we saw a divide. And so the tribal government was in favor of bringing temporary nuclear waste to the lands. And then the activists that I primarily worked with were arguing against the decision of their own government. And so some of the things that I think are really important about that case is that both sides were making arguments about sovereignty and how to best respect and move forward with sovereignty. Both sides, and so that's the people on the lands that didn't want it and the people who did want it, both sides were engaging in forms of decolonization. And many who were part of the tribal government that wanted the nuclear waste facility there were disappointed. So they would not, and I talk about this in the book, I see it as a win because I was aligned with the folks that were advocating against it, but they didn't see it as a win. And so one of the things that I try to work through, and I want to keep working through this, is the way that settler colonialism creates double binds, creates situations where maybe there aren't other options. One of the things that Leon Baer, who was the chair of the Skull Valley Band of Go-Shoot at the time that they were considering this option, said was, and I quote this in the book, and I can't remember exactly, but he says, okay, we're surrounded by all of these toxic facilities. We've got the Tooele Army Depot, we've got MagCorp, we've got Energy Solutions. There was a big sheep die-off that happened because of nerve gas that was coming out of the Tooele Army Depot. And he said, is anyone gonna buy a tomato from us? What are our options? Nobody's coming to our lands and saying, here's an economic opportunity. And so his argument was, this is an economic opportunity, and then we can restore our culture. We can, and so that's why they made the sovereign choice. So I'm really careful to kind of highlight that both sides are working in a system that's not set out to support the needs of Native peoples and nations. So hopefully that gives a little bit of an answer. But that was one of the trickier parts of the book to write through and to really really honor that even though I didn't agree with one side of that I totally understood why they were arguing for what they were arguing for, and I totally respect that sovereignty means that that's a decision that they could make.
I have a question that's right in that same line, but also kind of is, I don't know, it's kind of all over the place. I'm looking mostly for advice, I think maybe for your students, the students who are in the room, but also for those of us who are embarking upon similar kinds of projects and dealing with what we might call like the politics of decolonization, right? I think that it's interesting to me hearing you talk about like nuclear power, because I feel like that's also has like a politics. Is it good for the climate or bad for the climate? And I feel like in decolonization, there's also there's forms of decolonization, I heard you use that phrase, and there's like this kind of ideologically heavy movement towards decolonization. I wonder if you could say or offer advice for, maybe it's a methods question. How do you manage the article that comes to mind, like the tuck and yang kind of approach, right? Versus maybe on the other side, a more pragmatic, specific and placed kind of argument. Can you thread that needle somehow for us, or maybe offer some advice for those of us who are trying to do that kind of work or grappling with those problems?
Yeah, I'm going to throw some things out there and see, because I'm still working through it myself, and I do think, and I love methods, by the way. I think it is a methodological question and an approach. I mean, one of the things that I'm careful to say is that this book is not decolonization, that this book is retelling stories of folks engaged in decolonization efforts. And I do, in one of the chapters, kind of lay out a variety of different kind of theoretical resources that we could draw from to think about decoloniality, decolonization, all of those, Tuck and Yang, of course. And for those that don't know this article, it kind of argued decolonization is not a metaphor. This isn't a word that we should sort of use lightly. It's very historically specific in terms of land back and lifeways, bringing land and lifeways back, repatriating land and lifeways. So yeah, I mean, that I try to kind of be really clear that I'm not all, and I think this is in line with Tuck and Yang. I think that scholarship isn't always decolonizing, but maybe it's descriptive about decolonization efforts. And that there's great value to scholarship that maybe is bringing a decolonial perspective that's a little more about kind of ideology and theory, and so that's good work too. But I think push comes to shove, you kind of have to maybe figure out what it is that you want to amplify. And for me, it was more important for me to amplify what I thought were these embodied and in place enactments of decolonization. And so then that guided me to lean into decolonization as the word that I'm using, and then the theories that I was kind of drawing from. Okay.
Thanks so much. Thanks for those questions. Before you join me in thanking Danielle and Logan, I want to just give a couple quick announcements. In addition to our ongoing weekly Fellows Works in Progress presentations, we have some really exciting public events coming up here at the Tanner Humanities Center. On March 19th, we have the novelist Min Jin Lee coming. She's a National Book Award finalist, author of Pachinko, and that's March 19th over at the Utah Museum of Fine Arts at 7 p.m. And then I think the environmental humanities crowd probably knows this, but should know and should be really excited. We have Robin Wall Kimmerer and Kyle White coming April 17th and 18th. They will be giving a co-lecture and conversation in the moot court at 7 p.m. on the 17th over in the law school. And then we also have some exciting student opportunities. So if you're an EH student, please talk to Corey, talk to Danielle, talk to myself. We have exciting opportunities for some student walks with Robin up at Red Butte Gardens. So you heard it here. We have a tradition here at the Tanner Humanities Center. When scholars give us a gift of sharing their work with us and sharing exciting conversation with us, we like to give them a gift. We have these Tanner Humanities Center tumblers to give to both Logan and Danielle.
Thank you.
On a warmer, sunnier day, you can enjoy a nice cold beverage.
Yes.
Please join me in thanking Logan and Danielle.